as you're dating someone, like it's okay to give feedback, but I think it's always how you say it. It's kind of like saying, "Ooh, you're gonna wear that dress," versus "I really like it when you wear that red dress. That really seems to fit you, flatter you." It's
Right.
all in the way you frame the message, right?
Yeah. No, and I love that pointing out what you do like versus what you don't is such a powerful thing. Definitely an area of growth for myself. This is Relatable, Relationships Unfiltered. Hey, welcome to Relatable, Relationships Unfiltered. Today I'm hanging out with Elizabeth Overstreet, relationship expert and love strategist. We chat all about managing expectations in our relationships and how my own high standards keep getting in the way of my dating life. So, Elizabeth, I had the honor of joining you and your husband on your podcast. That was a few months ago now. And that was such a great conversation. I know you guys do a lot of that type of work together. And today, perfect topic for expectations, because I want to hear all about your guys' expectations in your marriage. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be on the show. I always have admired the work that you do out
Oh,
there.
thank
And,
you.
as you know, this work is so important to us because we want people to not have to repeat the same mistakes that we've made, or, we want to help shorten their learning curve. And sometimes people just don't know what they don't know about relationships. So but it's a fun work, and it's very fulfilling when you can see people get to that healthy relationship or get with that person that's the right connection for them. So I'm excited to talk about this.
Yes, absolutely. And the other component of that, and what I loved about our conversation as well when we chatted on yours, is just the normalizing of, like, even as relationship experts, that we still struggle and we still have our own things that we don't know or we don't do well. And so to be able to just talk about that as humans is so important to me. And I know, like, that is also something you do and that's important to you as well.
Yeah, like I always joke that yes, when I'm coaching someone, it's a lot easier for me because I'm a little bit removed from the situation. But then when I'm in my own relationship with my husband, I often don't have my coaching hat on. So I'm human just like everyone else out there. And it's like, oh shoot, that is not what you would advise someone to do. And sometimes my husband calls me out on that too. He'll be like, would you advise your client to make that move in that conversation? So he's holding me accountable, and then I have to hold me accountable because I want to make sure that when I'm expressing things to people, that it's realistic. Because
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of fluffy theories out there and sometimes unrealistic advice that
Hmm.
doesn't really showcase what happens in a relationship. We get snippets of things. So I think it's so important to give people like the truth serum, right?
Right.
So they know what's realistic to expect in a relationship.
Exactly. And that's exactly the topic today on expectations. And that's for sure what I want to talk about in terms of. So there seems to be two ends of the spectrum when it comes to expectations. There is the individuals that are maybe have really high expectations of themselves, of their partners. There's a lot that they want out of it, which there's nothing wrong with, but sometimes it can get unrealistic, which sets them up for disappointment. And then on the other end of the spectrum are the individuals who maybe did not grow up with the opportunity to express their wants, their needs, their boundaries. And so they're more focused on meeting their partner's expectations than expressing their own. Where do you tend to fall on that spectrum?
Wow, I know that's such a pendulum, right? Because there's the extreme of like, I know what I want, I know what I need, and I need you to show up this way. And then there's the person that just they don't know, or they lean more into the other side. So I feel like I'm in the middle. I like to say I'm pretty balanced, but look, like anyone else out there, I could be in my virtue. I always say patience isn't one of my virtues. So marriage, as you know, you've been there, it teaches you how to be, it forces you how to be patient. I'm
Yeah.
also a parent, so that's helped too. But like, I just think that I fall in the middle. Like, I feel like just like anyone else, I could have been in relationships where I felt insecure or
Mm,
anxious.
right.
But then I've also been in relationships where it felt great. And I was like, oh, this is what good looks like. But I always feel like going from what's not healthy to like something that's healthy feels really foreign at first because you're just not used to it, and you actually
Right.
second guess it sometimes more than you would the unhealthy situations, because sometimes we've just been through so much conditioning of that, or we grew up in households where we didn't see it modeled for us, so we just don't know what we know until we kind of hit our head against the wall a couple times,
Yeah.
figuratively speaking.
No, and that's so true, because that ties into the relational programming piece of that, that when we are programmed to engage or interact or really have relationships operate in a certain way, then that is what we come to expect. And so I talk to my clients about that so often when maybe they start dating, and they're aware of these red flags. So it becomes a bit of a confusion, and they're constantly second guessing themselves because they're so used to this one dysfunctional way that this maybe healthier and functional way actually feels, it creates discomfort for them. And so they start to question, like, okay, which is right, which is wrong, which is okay, which is not, because what feels comfortable is not always the healthiest option.
Right. And I think, it's just normal. Like you have to kind of figure out who you are. And that's a big part of my coaching philosophy. Like a lot of times we're putting that onus on the other person to do the right thing or to treat us the right way. But I feel like we have to teach people sometimes
Yeah.
how we want to be treated. We have to set those boundaries. Boundaries are actually a way of self-love and self-protection. And it's also teaching someone how to treat you. So it's like if you're not clear on that, I feel that makes it easier for you too to be back and forth and to accept certain things. So I think there almost has to be an awakening or like a period of self actualization where you're going through this journey of figuring out, like, who am I as a
Right.
person? What do I really want? Because I hear, you probably get this too. Like people come and sometimes they're married and they're like, he's not making me happy or she's not making me happy. And that onus really isn't on someone else to make you happy. There's a deeper thing going on usually, right? And it's really on you to kind of figure out these things. And that person should be adding to your happiness, no doubt. They shouldn't be like bringing you down all the time. But I think as soon as I hear those statements, I know something's kind of like missing where they're kind of wanting that other person to fill that gap. So I feel like that self-reflection, like figuring out who you are, what you want, like what's important to you, what your core values are, that's to me the most important part of the foundation or
Yeah, and
building.
a lot of that work identifying what are your wants, your needs, your boundaries, and like you're saying, your core values. Your values mean something in a relationship. What is important to you? Um, it's going to be important for your partner, there to be compatibility there. And so that ties
Totally.
in to the expectation piece, because I agree that we should not, of course, we should not rely on somebody else to make us happy. However, if we're feeling discontentment in a relationship or we're feeling like our needs aren't being met, then that does become, again, still, I believe the onus is still on the individual, but to express it. So it's not just
Absolutely.
like,
Yeah.
okay, you're not meeting my needs, so I'm okay with that, but rather, you're not meeting my needs. Can we talk about this?
Right. And let's come up with something. I think that's a huge sign that you're in the right relationship with someone is willing to have that discussion with you, to hear you, to validate what you're saying, take it in, and then there's
Right.
action behind it. So I agree with you. I don't think you should stay discontent in relationships, but I think where you have that person on that one end of the spectrum you talked about that's like looking for certain standards, sometimes they're almost like inflexible or immovable. And I don't
Mhm.
think that works either because we're all imperfect. So I
Right.
feel like no matter, even if you're with someone who it feels great with and there's compatibility, as you know, I mean, we both experienced it personally
Yep.
and professionally. We talk to people. There's always going to be things that are touchy topics or triggering. That it's just going to happen, even in a healthy relationship. You just hope you're both at the same point of being able to explore that in a healthy way, or get someone to intervene to help if you can't have those discussions. Because I
Yeah.
think the hardest is when people don't express, that creates that resentment you're talking about, that
Yep.
discontent. And it's hard to come back from that when that's been going on for years and years and years. Or when people expect the other person to understand. Like I've heard people say that, well, they should know me by now. And I'm like,
Mhm.
we are always evolving,
Yeah.
ourselves. So it's really not fair for you to be like someone, to expect someone to know what you want. I still think it's important to communicate it even over time because it can change.
Right. Or yeah, or to expect them to read your mind. And that's exactly it. That if we're not expressing these things, even if we have to give reminders, and that doesn't always feel ideal, because it's like, well, we've told them before, they should know. But people get caught up in their own things, their own lives, their own responsibilities and work and stressors and everything like that. And so those reminders are, they're okay. The problem is if the person either rejects it, dismisses it, they maybe give you a hard time about it, manipulate you, that's when it becomes a problem. But if they're like, oh,
Absolutely.
babe, yes, I'm so sorry, like, let me work on that, that's such a different story. How do
Totally.
you suggest that, like when you're working with your clients, like what is some verbiage that you suggest for people to use when they're expressing a need or a want to their partner?
Yeah, so I always tell people, like, preface it. Like, I mean, like, I'll use myself as an example with my husband. If I know it's a difficult subject, number one, I'm waiting for the right timing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna prep him that is coming, because no one
Yeah.
likes to talk, especially men.
Right.
Up to you. And then I'm like, hey, honey, I know this is a touchy topic, but this is how I'm feeling about it. So a lot of I statements, a lot of like expressing emotions behind it, because then it doesn't feel as, it doesn't put the other person on the defense as much, because you're really expressing how you're feeling, how you're taking it in. And if they love you, their reaction, it doesn't mean it won't be uncomfortable, because it's still, we've had conversations where I'm prefacing, I'm using I statements, I'm using feeling statements, and still it could be it's still gonna, it's a touchy topic. That's why it's a touchy topic.
Yeah.
But I just kind of allow him, I'll say how I feel and express it, give some examples. Then I'll be very explicit in what the expectation is that I want to accomplish. So like, I know some, I'll use like a client I've coached. Like a lot of times people will be like, I want more time. And I'm like, that's very generic. Like,
Yes.
I think you need to be specific. Like, I want to take a walk with you once a week, or I'd like us to go on a date once a month. I think you have to give people the roadmap, right? Because
Right.
time could look different to the person. So I would say to people, like, expressing it from your perspective, not using the you make me feel, because that just puts people on the
Mm-hmm.
defensive. And then really sitting back and knowing your partner's style of how they deal with a difficult topic, I think is the other piece.
Yeah.
So with my husband, I had to learn, like, I'm the person that likes to solve through and talk through things right away, and he's a processor. And
Mm.
I think what people need to realize is, like, there's value on both sides of the coin, because the processor is really emotionally trying to connect and understand a lot of times, like, why are you feeling this way? They're looking at all the nuances of it. And someone who's quick to solve, it's not that they're not looking at the emotional side, they're just more action oriented. And you need both. You need someone who could look at all the layers of the problem, peel back the onion, so to speak. And then you need someone on the other side to say, okay, now how do we execute and move forward? So that there's power in that. I think the challenge is when you have two avoiders.
For sure. If not impossible with two avoiders. That's what I always say, there's almost like value in the anxious and the avoidant coming together. That's why
Yeah.
they're so drawn to each other, because there is a balancing of that. And
Hmm.
I agree with that there is often the partner who is the processor, and they do need more time. And so I'm similar to you in personality, in terms of like, I want the solution now. I want to
Yeah.
know what we're doing. I want to know how it's going to be fixed. And that is not always conducive to other people's communication styles or how they make sense of things. And also sometimes puts them in a position to either say or do things that they don't actually mean. So whether they are getting defensive and so they say something that's hurtful, or sometimes they make commitments that they can't actually live up to because they're just trying to like help, like they see how badly you want to solve it. So they're like jumping in to try to do it with you,
Right.
but neither side of that is going to be effective if they just need more time to sit with it. And so
Yeah.
that's, yeah, great point. And when you're the receiver of that, I encourage people, reflect, validate, and explore the three
Hmm.
steps that I encourage people to do. So if you are coming to me saying you want more time, reflecting back, okay, I hear that you don't feel like we're getting enough time together, maybe you're not feeling like I'm prioritizing you, and then validating that. I see how you could feel that way. I know quality time is your love language. So I know that's really something that you need. And then explore. And the explore is really asking follow-up questions. And so, to your point, maybe even asking for the specificity in that, like, what does more time together look like? How can we do that in a way that works for both of us?
Yeah, and I think, like, there's so much power in that, because what you said is what I think a lot of discontent is comes from in relationships. People want to be seen,
Yeah.
heard, and validated. And if you look at any relationship that starts to like fall apart, I feel like those are consistent themes. I didn't feel appreciated. I didn't feel like you were listening to me. I didn't feel like you could see who I was or where I want to go. Like, those are other themes that like come up, that
Yeah.
recur where there's like relationship issues. And I think the other thing is like focusing on one issue at a time. Sometimes I heard this someone say this, and it was funny. She's like, I get angry wife syndrome, where like it just builds, 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 and then and it's almost like diarrhea of the mouth. Everything comes
Right.
out. It's like you're talking about 20 things, and the person on the other side is like, where did this come from? And it's just built up frustration because you haven't expressed yourself. And so
Yeah.
there's power in like really releasing, some things at a time. And that could be hard. I don't know about you. I don't want to put you on the spot, but for me, I'm like, sometimes I'm like, come on, let's get this done. So like when I have to hold back and I'm like, I just got to focus on one thing, that could be hard for some people.
Right. But if you're bringing it up regularly, and so that is something I really encourage for couples is to do weekly check-ins. I post about this all the time. I provide check-in questions on Instagram. But like when you're doing a weekly check-in, and I really encourage people, you have the same day, time. So whether you do it on, if you have a date every week, or maybe the kids are in bed by 8 p.m. So by 8:30, you're on the couch on, Thursday night at 8:30, that this is just when we do our check-in, and that you each are coming with maybe 2 or 3 questions that you can each think of on your own, or maybe you pull it from a list. But that is a really good opportunity to not allow these things to build up, because if you know that you're meeting every week to have this conversation, if there's something that happened on Sunday, you know that just in a few days, you're going to be able to talk about it, and you're going to be able to express it, and it's going to be a safe environment to do that. And that is exactly why I suggest it, because exactly what you're saying, that otherwise we tend to like bite our tongue until then we're just complete assholes and it all just explodes.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
just, and I think there's a thing that happens, like it's so normal when someone is criticizing you, your natural mechanism is to protect yourself and defend. So a lot of times we're doing like defensive listening, like we're waiting to just immediately rapid fire. Nope, I didn't do that because of this. Nope, nope, nope. As opposed to really just actively listening and really receiving what the person's saying and letting it kind of marinate and sit in the air a little bit. And
Yeah.
like you said, express it back, because perception can be reality, even though it's not always reality, right? It's
Sure.
perception. But sometimes our partners can have certain perceptions, and if we don't give them that space to express their perception, I think that's another thing that leads to communication eventually being shut down, because then they start to feel like I can't even express to you how I feel without you becoming defensive, or you're not leaning into trying to understand. So I love what you said with your 3 steps that you tell couples, and then them talking on a regular basis as well.
Yeah, and the resentment of that for sure. Then when the resentment builds, then they end, like when someone feels triggered, their reaction to their trigger often triggers the other person. And then if you don't resolve that, you're just going back and forth triggering each other. When you're talking about when somebody's feeling criticized, so I know I have a tendency, I would definitely fall on the end of high expectations. I believe that's why
Get up just a little bit.
I believe that's why I've been single for as long as I have.
I didn't remarry for a long time. I totally understand.
Yes. And it's hard because also like I don't need somebody, right? Like I do from a connection standpoint. Like
Right.
that sounds very
Right.
avoidant. And yes, I do fall into that category as well. But like as far as like my quality of life, like I don't need somebody for a dual income. I don't need somebody to like take care of me in that way. But I do desire connection. But I think because of my high expectations, I'm very quick I'll push somebody away very quickly. Or on the flip side of that, where this question was going, is I do tend to come across as critical. The last couple of people I've dated, that's been their feedback. I'm sure my ex, who's my very good friend, so he would tell me very openly and honestly that I can be a critical asshole sometimes. And so I'm aware
It's good
of
you guys have
that.
such open communication in that way. I have an ex-husband like that too.
Do you?
Yep.
It makes it so much easier. And quite honestly, he and I provide each other feedback. So I'll tell him a story maybe about somebody I'm dating. He's like, yeah, that sounds like you. I think that person's right. I'm like, okay, screw you. Not what I'm looking for. But how do you suggest that people can, maybe I'm asking for a friend, maybe I'm asking for myself here, to communicate in a way that is less critical, that can come across like, I can express to you my needs aren't being met, but I don't have to make you feel defective or insufficient because of my feelings. What does that look like when you're coaching?
That's a really good question, because I think it's when you have standards for the people out there like Liz and me too. When you have standards, you know what you want, right? It's like you're very clear on it. But at the same time, I think everything doesn't have to always be vocalized right away. I think in the beginning phases of getting to know someone, I always tell people this is your discovery time of dating someone. You don't have to give them all the answers to the test. Like
Mm,
I think sometimes it's wise to sit back and observe their behavior, right? And
right.
see what they do and see if they do some of the things you naturally would want them to do and assess it. But at the same time, you want to give feedback because sometimes we can't resist that. I think it's probably better to pose it as a question and to lean into it as curiosity.
Sure.
I noticed that you seem to make pretty quick decisions when it comes to money or whatever it is. Like what kind of drives that? Like it's interesting to
Mm,
me. And that way I think you're not sounding like you're poking at their decision making, but you're leaning into understanding how they make decisions. So I think coming from a place of curiosity, forming it more as a question as opposed to a criticism. And I think there's a time for that. Like I'm not saying you're like dating someone for a long time and you're never gonna like give them feedback. But I think in the beginning, we can shut down people. Like, I think, I coach men and women. Men are sensitive. Like, I don't think women realize how sensitive they are. They
yeah.
do feel a need to be perceived as the hero. They want you to look at them and think, wow, this is the best thing in my life. They need reaffirmations. And we wouldn't think that as women because we just see these guys and we're like, oh, they're cocky and they're saying this and that. But there's a lot of sensitivity layers under that. So I would just tell women if they're conscious, to be conscious of that as you're dating someone. Like it's okay to give feedback, but I think it's always how you say it. It's kind of like saying, "Ooh, you're gonna wear that dress," versus, "I really like it when you wear that red dress. That really seems to fit you, flatter you." It's
Right.
all in the way you frame the message, right?
Yeah. No, and I love that pointing out what you do like versus what you don't is such a powerful thing. So I really like it when you text me good morning, or I really like
Mhm.
it when you call me on your way home from work or something like that, versus you never call me or you never reach out to me. Definitely is going to land a lot differently.
It's like you're reinforcing, right? Like, if
Yeah.
you have a pet even you have a pet, you have a dog, right? Really
Yes.
cute dog, I remember. Like, if you want your dog to do something, you're not gonna be like, "You bad dog." Now, you may have those moments where you're like, "You're out of order," right? And the dog
Right.
knows it by your tonality, but most of the time, you're gonna, like, reward. You're gonna be like, "Here's a treat. Oh my god, that's so good you didn't tear up my shoes today. That's so great that you did this." And even the animal, right, can sense by your tone, "Oh, I'm pleasing her." Like, I'm doing things right. I'm getting treats. And so I think humans, men and women are like that too. Like we want that like reaffirmation, right? We want to know like I think if we're a person that is driven, and I think, most people want to achieve things. Some people don't, right? But
Yeah.
some people do. But if it's someone you're in a relationship with and you already have measured that, okay, they seem pretty similar to me because it sounds like you have high expectations. You talked about that they probably are hypercritical of themselves too.
Mm.
So they probably want you to give that feedback, but I think they also want the good feedback too. So I think it's all on how you wrap it up to them.
Right. And that's so important, that what is the number, like 3 to 5 positives per, the
Yeah.
one like feedback or whatever. And that is true. And I definitely an area of growth for myself. What are some of the
At least you have self-awareness. And I think, look, we're talking about this. Like I had gaps. So when I first was married and I got divorced, I was probably the worst person to date because I would be on a date with a guy and be like, "Ugh, what? You don't do that?" And I would be calling it out. And oh, that date would be over. Like, and for a minute there, it took me a while until I dated somebody who pretty much called me out that in a way I could receive it
Mm.
and was like, "You're very bitter." And I'm like, "What? Me? No, I just have high standards." He's like, "No, you're angry." And he was right. But it was like the
Mm.
first person to say it to me in a way like where I could actually say, you know what, I need to take a step back because there's a pattern here. So I
Mm.
think that self-reflection and being self-aware of it, that's key too. Like if you are
For
self-aware, that can
sure.
help you get past it. Cause at least you now know, okay, that's kind of my thing. I need to watch out for that a little bit.
Yeah, I completely agree. How long have you been married then? So this is your second marriage that you're in right now. And
Yeah, so
how,
this is my 2nd year. So we're still, I mean, we're early, we're under 10 years. Like we're, you
okay.
know, but I was married 10 years before,
Okay.
and then I was in long-term relationships in between. And I didn't want to get remarried for a long time. So it took me a long time because I was
Well,
scared. Because some of
yeah.
it, I think when you have high standards is protectiveness. You don't want to get hurt again. You don't want to, you feel foolish sometimes, even though you shouldn't, because we're
Right.
humans and we don't always know totally who someone is until we're in it with them. And we make mistakes along the way that we sometimes are just not aware we're making because it's hard to see ourselves. But I was scared. I was like, nah, I'm never getting married again. But
That's me.
I was like,
Never.
never ever. And there's always someone that comes right when you say that. But yeah, I was just like, no, I'm good. And to your point, I get what you're saying because I was at a point too where it's like, I don't need anyone to take care of me. I'm pretty independent. I don't need extra income. I'm comfortable. But then it was like I went on this trip to Jamaica. I was in this. My friend had gifted me their timeshare on an island, and I was in Montego Bay, which I didn't realize at the time is like one of the honeymoon destination spots of Jamaica, and I was like the only single person. And but it was still a good trip because I
Yeah.
think people need to do that. But I ended up with couples the whole trip. They kept trying to take care of me, which was really sweet. But then I was in this beautiful hotel room and I was like, man, I have, my daughter is doing great. I'm very accomplished, but I'm like, I really want someone I wish I could have someone here to share it with. I had
Mhm.
that moment. And I was
Yeah.
like, this is what people mean, kind of like, and it feels very cliche to say it, but we do want companionship. And
For
so to
sure.
your point, I wanted that connection. I was like, I want to be connected to someone. I want to be able to share my, golden years with
Yeah.
someone, be able to travel and do things. So, but I think also the key to it for me, and I think people may be able to relate to this, is you got to be in the right spot too with
Right.
yourself,
How did you meet your husband then?
Wow. So this is a funny story. So I actually met my husband's sister first, and we were good friends. And I met him through her. And so we went to work out with him. And I was like, you have a brother? You never mentioned that. She's like, I have two. I said, were you hiding them away or something? And at the time, I wasn't like, I actually was dating someone else. I wasn't even like interested or anything like that. But that relationship was kind of falling. I was like, oh, I don't know where it's going to go. But I wasn't focused or preoccupied on what was soon to be my husband. But how he won me over was I was like dating someone and I was like, ooh, this doesn't feel right. This person's not treating me the way what I would like, the way I would like him to. There's some things that don't feel right. There's a mismatch. And time had passed. Like I broke up with that person, time passed. And then what really attracted to me to Kay is that like the way he showed up for me. And I realized like for me, I had dated guys that were successful, guys that weren't, like all the whole gamut. And what I realized I really desired was a guy to emotionally be mature. That
Mm,
was really important to me because I hadn't met that many guys that could fill that bucket. And so
right.
he really showed up that way for me very strongly. I was like, I could really like cry with this guy and he doesn't react weird or anything. He pours in that moment. So
Yeah.
it was interesting. Yeah.
What does emotional maturity? That's a great thing to talk about here because I do think that that ties into expectations. I know for me, for sure, emotional intelligence, emotional maturity,
Mhm.
like that is huge for me. And it really something that's hard to find. And I don't just mean in men, in all
In
genders, it's a
general.
really
Yeah.
hard thing. Yeah. And so that is often where maybe I start chatting with somebody or talking to somebody, and then I'm just so like turned off by that
Yeah.
lack of emotional maturity. How do you define emotional maturity? Like, what does that look like to you?
Yeah, it's someone who can the things we're talking about, someone who can communicate with you, someone who could talk about difficult subjects. It doesn't mean it's not going to be tenuous or some tension there, but you can get through it. You don't feel like each time you bring up something, they're at a flight risk or that
Right.
they're going to, turn it against you. It's just a very respectful communal, relationship. It's like a friendship there too, to that.
Yeah.
So, but I think the emotional maturity is like people just being able to have conversations, plan things, talk about things in a realistic way.
Right.
Because look, we're at a point, like I was at a point, like I have a daughter. I, you know, I have a future I'm trying to plan. I know where I want to be because I think you get to that point in life, you should at least. And so if someone's not emotionally mature, they can't meet you there. And if they're not in the same like thought process or they're not even able to really show up for you and have those discussions and like really connect that way, you'll know because it just feels disconnected. It's like they're
Right.
almost throwing you off constantly.
Right.
But when there's emotional maturity, I mean, it's not that there's not some up and down, but you can get through it because you're on the same wavelength.
Yeah. And I wonder, like, if how most people are operating out there, because I just get so confused when I'm like talking to somebody, like in, let's say, in their 40s or even early 50s, and just the inability to hold good conversation, the inability to ask
Yes,
questions, to
questions.
ask you
Yeah.
about yourself. And I was talking to a client about that this week. She's like, I started talking to somebody recently. She met him on an app and they've been talking. And she's like, I like him, but when we're talking, he doesn't ask me about myself. Like, he's not
Mhm.
asking questions back. And he's in his early 60s. And I'm thinking, like,
Right.
people really do go through life this way. And what my suggestion to her was, like, he does sound like he's receptive to feedback. So what would happen if you had that conversation with him? Like, maybe, like you were saying earlier, no one had called you out in a way you could receive that, the
Right.
bitterness or the
Feedback.
anger. And
Mhm.
so sometimes it really is just bringing it to their attention. But all that to say, I'm like, what the hell? How are these people like getting through like day-to-day life with lack of emotional maturity?
Well, you know this, like you talk to patients all the time. It's like I think people stop sometimes their development at a certain point based on their life, based on what they
Yeah.
experience. I was in a relationship with that like that before, just like that ladies with that 60-year-old and the guy was older. And I thought, okay, he should have it together. And he did in certain ways. And I think that's where people get confused. So men, I think, are highly, and I don't want to generalize, but I'm going to generalize a little bit. Men, I
Sure.
think, are like sometimes hyper focused and told to be good providers and to protect.
Yeah.
So they like hang into that so hard. They go to that direction so hard that they focus wholly on that. But then there's emotional maturity, there's spiritual maturity, there's sexual maturity, and those
Yeah.
are gaps. And so the person that was older than me, I was surprised. Like I literally would feel like if we had a discussion, I was like, oh my God, I'm talking to a teenager. But
Mm,
then as I like started learning more about the person, their development kind of stopped as a teenager. Like they were married young. They really didn't have, a maternal figure in their life. There were some gaps there. They didn't have a paternal figure. They had like more of an older, a grandparent that raised them. So I was like, oh my God, like there's that lack of maturity may have come through some of the things that they just didn't have exposure to growing
yeah.
up. Because literally it was like a teenager. And that's how what you'll hear people say that. They'll be like, I feel like I'm with like a teen. And
Mhm.
sometimes you are based on where their development is.
Yeah, and like you're saying, even the sexual maturity and the intellectual foreplay is such a big thing for me, to be able to have deep, insightful
Yep.
conversations, to be able to go to a museum, to go look at art, all of that. But like, as you're saying, there's a lot of people, they just don't operate like that. That is, either it wasn't role modeled, they didn't have opportunities to do that. And for some people, they're just not interested in it. And that's okay too. Um, but it's making the dating pool very shallow
It's
for me.
hard, yeah, and that's why like I always say, dating is discovery, like, make sure you are leaning into, asking those questions, and that's why it's so important to know, like, what's your blueprint? What's important to you? It doesn't have to be an exhaustive list, but, like, if it's important to you to have someone that where you can have intellectual conversation, you're with someone, they just they're not there, but you know this is a driver for you, you need to pay attention to that. It doesn't mean it can't work, but it may be a challenge, right? So, to your point, there is a lot of that out there. Like it's very interesting and it does make it harder.
How do you help your clients to like determine what realistic expectations are? So, especially for some of us with higher expectations, higher standards, and there's this laundry list of things that we want. How do you help them to decipher like what really matters and what are some things they can let go? I know a lot of my clients will ask that, like, I don't know if I let this go, if that means I'm settling or if I'm,
Mhm.
giving into less than I deserve. So, where is that balance?
Yeah, number one, I think that you've been married, right? Everyone settles on some level, meaning
Yep.
like I'm not saying that you should settle for less than what you deserve. I'm not about that life, but I think there's always going to be something that you're going to wish your partner had that they don't have. And I think the key is on that, and this is going to throw people off, is you need variety in your relationships because I think when we lean into our partner for just one for everything, that's setting your relationship up for failure. But I think the value of your relationship growing is you actually have an outside interest, having outside friendships to cultivate certain things. Because sometimes you're just not going to be with that person that gets certain aspects of you, but you could have a friendship where that exists.
Right, right.
right?
I completely agree. You can have other elements of your life to fill the void.
Yeah, but to your point, there's a balance. So I think you can't be inflexible because you have to realize like you're imperfect too. And there's things that are hard about you too,
I have a
right?
lot of my own red flags for sure.
So like that I had to come to that realization like, hey, I mean, and you could be great. Like and I'm not saying like, because people will be looking at this like I am great and you could be great, but there's still some things that just like we have positive attributes, we have deficits, right? So
Right.
I think it's important to be balanced towards that. And I think it's important to like look at, qualities or attributes that like that are long standing. So what do I mean by that? Like someone who has humility, if that's important to you, because that's going to be there whether they're rich or poor, right?
Yeah.
Someone who has a sense of ethics around work and family, or a discipline for going after something and doing it like that. If that's important to you, like don't settle on those things. If you see someone has a poor work ethic and they're lazy and you're driven, I'm not saying they have to be as driven as you, because that's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying like you want someone that does have some get up and go. You're going to
Yeah.
want that because you're going to resent that if they don't. So I
And
think, yeah.
someone who also understands it, right? So like
Right.
if you have those things that are important to you, that at least they're supportive of them. But
Exactly.
yes, keep going.
Yeah, and like so my husband always say like we do our podcast together, Bad Talks, but like I know I chose this life to put myself out there and talk about this stuff. So I bring him along when he wants to be, but I don't force that on him. But at the same time, he understands it's important to me. So he
Yeah.
never tries to say you shouldn't do this or don't, you need to give that up. Like I feel like people should be supportive of the things that make you happy, that fill your cup. That's another sign. I think sometimes like we focus on things like, I mean, it's just interesting. I remember seeing something where they're like, this guy is 6 feet tall, he has 3 kids or whatever. But they made a ridiculous scenario up: 3 kids, 3 different mothers, being dramatic. And then they were like, okay, this guy over here is 5'7". He's never had kids, and he's an accountant, right? And people were still going for the 6 feet tall guy because of like the physical piece. And I'm not
Mhm.
saying like there's not something to having some attraction to the person you're with. I'm not saying you have to date someone that you're not attracted to. I'm just saying to look beyond what we sometimes think we want, because sometimes that's where we discover actually what we need,
Yeah.
right? What actually what we could be valuable to us having a relationship with someone that's a little different. So the joke was like sometimes we'll look at these like arbitrary features and we'll just like give into it because we're like, okay, they have money, they have car, they have this. And I think all those things are important, but those things can shift. And I think the character traits to me are more important because those are more long
Right.
standing. Those you'll see when a person's stressed out, when they're happy, when they're trying to figure things out. That's those are things you see that show up consistently.
Yeah, and that really affect quality of life. So what kind of car they drive or how much money they have, like, yes, that can enhance,
Yeah,
but
yes.
their character is what really is going to drive your day-to-day quality of life and
Right.
like how content you are in that relationship. But that's a funny though example that you gave. I had a client about a year ago and she dated pretty much only professional athletes. And because of that, she clearly ran into what you would expect to run into with professional
Yes.
athletes.
That's a different
Um,
life.
and I said to her one day, what about the accountant? Like I literally said that exact thing. Like, what if we just maybe looked at a different, like the stable,
Right.
just maybe more low key man might go a long way.
Yeah, because you'll hear people say, "I have preferences. I have preferences," and I always like to do like an inventory. Okay, let's talk about that. Like, tell me about those relationships. Tell me what happened. And I was so excited because I had a client that had a breakthrough because he's dating someone that's not his normal type or
Mm,
preference, and he was like, "It's really weird, but she gets me." Like, I realized like I need someone that's in it for the long term. That's what I'm looking for at this point in my life, and a lot of things I was focused on before, they were temporary
right.
because aesthetically they may have been, appealing. And it's not saying the woman he's with is not appealing, but he said he was kind of looking just one sided. He wasn't looking multidimensional. So now he's with someone that has those multidimensional facets, and she isn't the type that he would have normally dated. And now he's talking about marrying her. So,
Yes.
like, I think there's something to exploring at least. You don't have to marry them, but
Right.
exploring outside of your normal type of who you think is always, gonna be that person that's compatible for you.
Yeah, and that's where, really identifying your needs in a relationship and when I talk a lot to my clients who are dating about that, identifying their needs, wants, and boundaries, like I was saying earlier. But your needs are really the non-negotiables. But I really encourage them only to pick about 5 of those, because really, if you can determine what is this like handful of non-negotiables, then you give yourself space to date people who maybe you wouldn't typically, or who maybe are outside of that box. So like for me, that they have a job, they don't have young children. Like I have just a very handful of that. Now I have a lot of other standards and expectations on my preference list,
I want
but
to hear about your list. That's like another show.
yeah, my list is probably way too long, and probably yes, but my needs, and also with the core values, that ties into that as well. Like I need somebody who's driven but loyal and dependable, and so I think when you really know what are those things that have to be there, it gives you space to explore some of those other things. But I just want to, before we wrap up, I want to talk about the other aspect of expectations. So we talked about wants and needs. Boundaries is really the third like aspect of when we have expectations for our partners. How do you kind of describe that to your clients? How do you talk about boundaries? And then let's talk about how we can implement and really identify what your boundaries even are.
Yeah, I think boundaries are super important. And again, that is your way of you teaching someone how to treat you. And I think why we get sometimes like nervous about boundaries is because of people's reaction to when we set boundaries. And that's something I've had to like work on. So like, oftentimes like I've set my boundary and then the reaction is not what I think. And I'm like, ooh, did that work? And I had to come to a realization it really wasn't about it working for the other person. It's about it working for me. And so I think
Right.
in a relationship, it's super important to realize that you may set a boundary. The person may not respond favorably to it, but that's okay because you're giving them an indication, you're giving them guardrails of how to operate with you. I also think it's important like not to have an exhaustive list of boundaries
Mm,
because that could be off-putting. I think there's balance with everything. I think when you're setting boundaries, that as long as you communicate it in a respectful way, that the other piece is holding people accountable, that you need to
mhm.
own that. Like they definitely may try to push your boundaries, but it's up to you to like push them back, and say, nope, that's not acceptable. And if they continue to do that, that's another clear sign that they aren't respecting your boundaries. And that's probably not going to be the best relationship dynamic for you. Because when it's a mutually respectful relationship, a person is going to respect your boundaries. So I think it's important to set them. I think people shouldn't like get nervous that how people respond, but more so thinking of it from this is what I need. This is what I'm how I'm telling someone to treat me. And then the other thing is not assuming that people are always trying to intrude on your boundaries. So like I
Mm,
think it's easy to jump into this assumption thing based on how we would do something, but sometimes people just don't know. They don't know what
sure.
they don't know. Like
Yeah.
like for some people, a boundary might be if you lie, I'm out. Because maybe they had such like experiences where someone, people lied to them consistently and it led to some very dire situations. Now, that may feel like an extreme boundary to somebody. They might be like, it was a white lie. But in that person's mind, they're like, nope, you lied. That's everyone has their thing. So I think boundaries are very
Right.
personal and you have to think to yourself, like, what's important to me that people respect? What are the guardrails I want to put around me? Of how people treat me and how they engage with me. You need to be clear on that and then enforcing it as well.
Right. And knowing that, yes, a healthy boundary is firm but flexible. And so
Yes.
we can
Yes.
have, like, if we know it's important to us, we can set it, but there also is times where it might shift a little just depending on the situation. But as you're saying, a boundary without a consequence is just a suggestion. And so if you
Mhm.
set a boundary, but then you're not willing to hold it, there was really no point in you setting it to begin with, because now you both are just feeling uncomfortable or annoyed, but it's not actually protecting you in the way it's intended to.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll go back to pets and kids. Like sometimes it's hard. Like as a parent, I can speak to this. Like you feel bad that your kid is looking sad that you set this boundary,
Yes.
but you also set this boundary because you're like, this is for the good of my child. This is going to help my child to do better, right? Or to go through this experience and understand they can set boundaries. So I think looking at it from
Yeah.
the lens of like this is almost legacy building you're doing. Especially if you grew up in a household where you were, you had a role. Everyone has a role in their
Yes.
family, right? And maybe you were the people pleaser or the high achiever or the person who everyone calls when there's a crisis. So like you just feel this obligation to always do things. You may have been taught not to set these boundaries, but think about the power, number one, of you being able to do things differently, but also if you have children who can watch you, right? And now you can break that pattern that was built in, by your, how you grew up or how you were raised. So I just think boundaries are, I think that it's really key that people hone in on what they need. And to your point, firm but flexible, because sometimes people have an exhausted list of boundaries, and that's when I think it can get dangerous, or where they're unmovable.
Right.
That's like an impossible relationship.
Yeah, because it's hard to have any kind of collaboration or connection when you are guarded. There is a difference between a wall and a boundary. And so when you
Yeah.
are guarded by all of these rules, like just like everybody, and then everyone around you is on eggshells, and there's a lack of a really healthy boundary is going to create safety, because that other person knows what to expect from you. You know what to expect from them. Clear is kind. And so when there is very open conversation around these expectations, then people can feel safe. But when they're done as a wall, or they're rigid, or they are done as a punishment, we've just removed the safety from the purpose of the boundary, and now we've just made it more punitive, which creates disconnect and rupture versus connection.
I love that, because I feel like there's soft boundaries and there's rigid boundaries, right? And so
Yeah.
we know, like within a relationship, the rigid one could be like, I'm not going to deal with infidelity, or I'm not going to deal with physical abuse, right? But a
Right.
soft boundary could be like, I don't want you to raise your voice when you speak to me. It doesn't mean that if that person does do it, that is over, but you're going to come
Right.
back to them again and say, you know what? I told you before, this is one of the things that's important to me, that you don't raise your, voice when you're speaking to me, because it makes me feel this way. How do we communicate in a way where that doesn't happen? So I feel like you do have to be flexible, because we're imperfect. There's going to be
Yeah.
some imperfections and things that happen along the way.
For sure. We're all making mistakes. We're all learning. We're all growing. Absolutely. Elizabeth, thank you so much for hanging out with me and for your insights. Where can everyone find you on social media, your website?
Yeah, so if people want to learn more about me, my name is Elizabeth Overstreet. I'm a relationship expert, and I focus on helping people build healthy relationships. And they can learn more about me at my website at elizabethoverstreet.com. And you'll find all my social media handles that way on my website as well. And I always tell people, don't wait till it gets bad to come and see me, though I can deal with that too. But like, even if you just want to make your relationship better, or you want to be proactive, or you're getting ready to get married, those, I can certainly help you through like communication hurdles and dealing with boundary settings and things we talked about, to help you have that good, happy relationship, or rewarding relationship.
Yes, absolutely. And your social media is really valuable as well. You post a lot of really helpful things and just cute videos and things that provide good insight, but then also like provide good ideas for these healthy relationships. So go find her social medias as well. Thank you again, Elizabeth. I really appreciate you hanging out.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for giving such good advice on how to do better with managing my own expectations. And thank you all for hanging out on Relatable Relationships Unfiltered. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up for my newsletter, and find me on Instagram at Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick.